Welcome to the Stage 6 video series. In this video, we will learn how to use the past perfect simple tense and the past perfect continuous tense. We form the past perfect simple tense by using the past simple of the verb to have plus the past participle of a main verb. For example, to make a past perfect positive sentence using the main verb to eat, we can say, I had eaten, you had eaten, he had eaten, she had eaten, it had eaten, we had eaten, you had eaten, and they had eaten. We should also remember that it is common for English speakers to use contractions when speaking. We say, I'd eaten, you'd eaten, he'd eaten, she'd eaten, it had eaten, we'd eaten, you'd eaten, they'd eaten. To make a negative sentence, we must use haven't plus the past participle of a main verb. Using the main verb to eat, we can say, I hadn't eaten, you hadn't eaten, he hadn't eaten, she hadn't eaten, it hadn't eaten, we hadn't eaten, you hadn't eaten, they hadn't eaten. We use the past perfect tense to speak about actions that finished before a time in the past. For example, John had eaten before he went to work. In this sentence, the past perfect, John had eaten, tells us that John had finished eating before he went to work. In the second example, Susan had taken a shower before she left her house this morning. The past perfect tense, Susan had taken a shower, tells us that first Susan took a shower and later she left her house. Finally, the sentence Paul had worked in Dublin before he moved to Milan. The past perfect tense, Paul had worked in Dublin, tells us that first Paul worked in Dublin and later he moved to Milan. To make sentences using the past perfect continuous tense, we must use the verb had plus been plus the present participle of the main verb. For example, to make positive sentences in the continuous tense using the verb study, we would say, I had been studying, you had been studying, he had been studying, she had been studying, it had been studying, we had been studying, you had been studying, they had been studying. When speaking, it is common to contract the subject and the verb to have, so we can also say, I'd been studying, you'd been studying, he'd been studying, she'd been studying, it had been studying, we'd been studying, you'd been studying, they'd been studying. To make negative sentences using the past perfect continuous, we use the past negative form of the verb have plus been plus the present participle of the main verb. For example, using the verb study, we can say, I hadn't been studying, you hadn't been studying, he hadn't been studying, she hadn't been studying, it hadn't been studying, we hadn't been studying, you hadn't been studying, they hadn't been studying. We use the past perfect continuous to speak about an action that continued up to a point in the past. For example, Joe had been waiting for 20 minutes when Sue arrived. In this sentence, the past perfect continuous, Joe had been waiting for 20 minutes, tells us that Joe was waiting when Sue arrived. Paul had been working for 6 hours when the computer broke. In this sentence, the past perfect continuous, Paul had been working for 6 hours, tells us that when the computer broke, Paul was working. When the guests arrived, the chefs had been cooking for 3 hours. In this sentence, the past perfect continuous, the chefs had been cooking for 3 hours, tells us that when the guests arrived, the chefs were cooking. In this video, we have learned that we make the past perfect tense using had plus the past participle of a main verb. We learned that we use the past perfect to speak about actions that finished before a time in the past. We also learned that we make the past perfect continuous using had plus been plus the present participle of a main verb. We learned that we use the past perfect continuous to speak about an action that continued up to a point in the past. This video was brought to you by the Central School of English, an English school in Dublin. For more lessons, go to centralschool.ie.